Good evening, everyone. We'll get started. Lisa's here, yes. I'm Liz Schell, the Chair of Planning, and we have Councillor Osanek, Councillor Neal, who is the Vice Chair, Councillor McLaren, Councillor Turner, and Councillor Allen. And we have a variety of staff members here. We have our Commissioner Hurdle, beside her Director Agnew, and Planner Sands is by himself, and then we have Planner Eusebio, Manager Newman, and a consultant, Laura, who will be introduced a little bit later. Thanks. Oh, I thought you were a consultant. Well, welcome. Thank you. Okay, I will begin with the regular, and our clerk, Ms. Blumenberg, without whom I'd be in trouble. This is the public meeting introduction. Notice of collection. Personal information collected as a result of this public hearing and on the forms provided at the back of the room is collected under the authority of the Planning Act and will be used to assist in making a decision on this matter. All names, addresses, opinions, and comments may be collected and may form part of the minutes which will be available to the public. Questions regarding this collection should be forwarded to the Director of Planning, Building, and Licensing Services. The purpose of public meetings is to present planning applications in a public forum as required by the Planning Act. Following presentations by the applicant, committee members will be afforded an opportunity to ask questions for clarification or further information. The meeting will then be opened to the public for comments and questions. Interested persons are requested to give their name and address for recording in the minutes. There is also a sign-in sheet for interested members of the public at the back of the room. No decisions are made at public meetings concerning applications unless otherwise noted. The public meeting is held to gather public opinion. Exemption to this rule is outlined in Bylaw Number 2006-75 to delegate various planning approvals to staff and to adopt certain procedures for the processing of planning applications subject to delegated authority. Council has authorized staff to use discretion in determining if an application can be a combined public meeting comprehensive report to expedite the approval process. Information gathered at public meetings is then referred back to Planning, Building, and Licensing Services staff for the preparation of a comprehensive report and recommendation to Planning Committee. This means that after the meeting tonight, staff will be considering the comments made by the public in their further review of the applications. When this review is completed, a report will be prepared making a recommendation for action to this committee. The recommendation is typically to approve with conditions or to deny. This committee then makes a recommendation on the applications to City Council. City Council has the final say on the applications from the city's perspective. Following council decision, notice will be circulated in accordance with the Planning Act, and anyone with an interest in the matter may file an appeal. Interested persons are advised that if a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions before the bylaw is passed, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision of the council to the Ontario Municipal Board unless, in the opinion of the board, there are reasonable grounds to do so. And tonight we do have one public meeting to start, and this will be an application for a zoning bylaw amendment 5059 Leo Lake Road, and Mr. Toe will be presenting. Thank you.
Thank you. So as noted by the chair, this is an application for zoning bylaw amendments for 5059 Leo Lake Road. It's in support of applications for consent for severance previously filed with the city. So the zoning bylaw application is specifically to increase the minimum setback from what's currently required of 15 meters to 40 meters from a water body or water course, and to also establish a setback from natural hazard, a slope on the property as recommended by the Conservation Authority and an environmental study that was done in support of the severance applications. So the subject property is on Leo Lake Road, which is just off Highway 15 south of Sealy's Bay. It's about a 6-hectare property with an existing dwelling on it, and 2 lots are proposed on the east and west of the existing property. The lot is currently in the A2 zone, which is a rural zone. The proposed severed lots meet the requirements for minimum distance separation from a nearby farm, also meet the setbacks recommended in the environmental study, the 30-meter setback from the watercourse, and any required setback from natural hazard features, in this case, top of bank setback for a slope. So this sketch is a little bit busy, but it just identifies a number of different things. So the house on the lot right now is about in the middle right here. So that's proposed to be a 1-hectare retained parcel, so about 2.5 acres. And then there's a parcel to the west here, and then a parcel to the east over here. Those are both quite large parcels, 2+ hectares each. The yellow shading on both of these indicates the building envelope recommended by the Conservation Authority in the environmental study, taking into account 40-meter setback from the water and also from a water course on the east part of the property here. So both of those proposed properties have a minimum 0.5 hectare building envelope, which is about 1 acre outside of those recommended setbacks, and also some of the environmentally more sensitive areas on the site. There's a wetland along the water in this area of Leo Lake, so the setbacks will be ensuring that those areas are not disturbed as well. So with respect to the official plan policies, the property is in a rural designation, and there are a number of policies that apply, and the application is consistent with those policies, including locating the property or the residential development outside of areas of natural hazard and natural heritage. It's compatible with adjacent uses, which are predominantly rural residential with limited agriculture. It meets the ribbon of life policies, which is that 30-meter buffer area along the water, and actually increases it to 40 meters. And overall respects the policies and conforms to the policies of the official plan. With respect to the zoning, the property is currently zoned A2. It's proposed to be placed into a site-specific A2 zone to establish increased setbacks from the water body, and also any necessary setback from the top of slope of a bank, or top of bank of a slope on the property. The proposed rezoning just implements the recommendations of the environmental study in the CRCA. So in conclusion, we just ask that council or the planning committee would recommend the amendment for approval to council when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you. And could we hear from staff, please?
Through you, Madam Chair, the application was noticed as per the requirements of the Planning Act. Thanks.
Thank you. Comments, questions from the committee? Are there any members of the public who have comments or questions about this application? Councillor Neal.
Yes, could I just ask if any of the, I know that there would be a contact area that this meeting was taking place. Did you have any responses from neighboring properties who were concerned?
Mr. Hurd.
Through you, Madam Chair, I received one telephone call regarding the application from an applicant who lives across the lake, and it was more as to a general inquiry as to the process and as to what exactly the site-specific zoning would be completing, and I explained further what the increases of water setback, water course, and top of bank setbacks would be, and the applicant was, or the individual was satisfied. Thanks.
Councillor Osanek.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't get asked for a copy of the EIS, but was it the conservation area that asked for 40 meters, or did the conservation say it should be 60 meters and then it's just been decided 40 meters?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. No, the environmental study recommended a setback of 40 meters from the water, and the Conservation Authority concurred with that. So, yeah.
Seeing no other questions, I will close this public meeting, and thank you very much. I'm going to call the meeting to order. I would like to change the agenda. It gets a little complicated, but here we go. We're still going to have our delegation, and then our director, Paige Agnew, would like to give a little opening speech or talk, and then we will have our planner, Eusebio, introduce the residential development supply, and then so that we won't have Mr. Newman first. It'll be first Director Agnew, then Ms. Eusebio, then Manager Norman will introduce intensification, and that's when we'll receive that report, and then he will introduce Laura McCormick, who's going to present the community benefits plan. So what you see in front of you is a little different, so I'd ask that would someone move the approval of the agenda as amended. Councillor Neal, seconded by Councillor Turner. All those in favor? And that's passed. Minutes of the Planning Committee, April 7th. Would anyone like to move them? Councillor Allen, seconded by Councillor Turner. Changes, omissions? Seeing none, all those in favor? Thank you. Disclosure of pecuniary interest? There are none. And we do have one delegation, Mr. Soper, if you'd like to come to the microphones, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Planning Committee. I'm here, I guess, on behalf of concerned citizens, just to do with the question of development on Queen Street that's coming up. I preface my remarks to say that I have some friends who would probably like to see little thatched cottages up and down Queen Street. Other friends think that maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 stories is a good development, and other friends who are very much in favor of the high-rises that are proposed, 15, 20 stories. Some friends even who say tongue-in-cheek we should just bulldoze all the limestone buildings in the city. So I have a wide spectrum of friends, and I want to try to speak for all of them rather than get emotional about a topic that's dear to my heart. You'll see in the front there I've created a small model of Kingston. Certainly it's incomplete. It shows the major buildings, well, the buildings that form our downtown core, including City Hall, St. George's, and further up St. Mary's. And in as best a model as I can achieve, I've also put in the proposed high-rise buildings on the Queen Street, all 3 of them. And certainly from my perspective, I think the height is too great in relationship to all the other buildings that are in that vicinity. I would also say that the buildings are architecturally boring, and that's another matter. There is a question that's coming up, which is this matter of bonusing. I think will be discussed perhaps tonight, wherein a developer who wants to build higher than the allowed or proposed heights set by the planning, the official plan, can get permission to go up extra stories if they do some sort of community action in response, like perhaps build a swimming pool or a public library. I'm not sure what the idea is. And that's where I begin to become concerned, because I think an official plan should almost be about as sacred as a speeding or driving speed limit on a highway, on a 401. If someone drives at 200 kilometers an hour on the 401, we don't let them off with a goodwill gesture like building a library for the community. We take away their car, we take away their license, and we give them a $10,000 fine. I believe that's currently the case. So I'm a little bit surprised that there is even the idea that one can allow a development to go beyond a very rational and long-standing planning official plan that has been formed through studies and deliberation with all kinds of experts. How can we then turn around and change that plan simply because the developer is prepared to give us a public park? And you can be sure that the developers know the numbers when they're doing their counting, and if it's going to cost them a library or a park or swimming pool, they're still coming out ahead. So let's not be fooled by that. I have some papers here which I'd like to pass out before my 5 minutes is up. It's too much to read, but I think we need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions with regard to this, with our future. How many people do we expect to come to Kingston in the next 10, 15, or 20, or 30, or 40, 50 years? How many people will this city bring in as new inhabitants What's the sort of population development of the country, of the city over the next few decades? And given that number, how many acres of land do we need to develop to house them? And given that number, how many people are we expecting to house per vacant city block? And we have plenty of empty blocks all up and down Queen Street. They're asking to be filled, not with thatched cottages, but with something substantial. Do we need 25 stories or 20 stories of people? Perhaps we do. Maybe the numbers will tell us that we need to do a building boom of 15, 20 stories all up and down Queen Street to house all the people that will come to the city. But maybe those numbers will tell us that 5 or 6 stories are good enough. Or maybe 3. Maybe Frontenac Village will end up being a perfect model. And I think we have to have these numbers first as a very rational adult kind of approach to this problem, and not just let our emotional state of desire for a quaint old city or a modern metropolis to get in the way of rational thinking. So when we have those numbers, we can say, yes, we need to build something. We need to build to contain a certain number of people. What is the best building? Is it necessarily a glass needle? Glass needle would look fantastic, maybe, but maybe not down here. Maybe some other building would look better. There are other questions too, and again, these papers express those just briefly. Some concerns would be, what are the implications of traffic if we have too many people? Do we have enough schools? We've lost a school just recently, KCVI. Are we going to have to reopen that school because we're inviting more people into our development that's required up and down Queen Street? So these questions have to be looked at, and I'm a person who likes to get emotional, and so I'm putting the brakes on myself. I hate what's being proposed. I'll say that openly, I hate it. But if someone can prove to me that we need that height, then I will acknowledge that that is required. I can still hate the design. There may be a better design. It's going to cost more. Do we care? Are we proud enough of our city that we want to spend or force developers to spend enough money to give us development that we can be proud of? Can we have 20 stories that would make us feel that we have made a good deal and not one that's simply been an exchange for a public park or swimming pool or something like that? So it's still a debate. It's being pushed forward. I really think we have to be the ones in control here. We cannot let other people, outsiders with other interests. It's a debate that is for the citizens of Kingston and for the councillors and for the people who are aware of planning issues to work together on. The fundamental thing being, I think we all agree that empty parking lots on Queen Street are ugly, and that intensification is probably the thing we need for the future of the city as we go forward. So if we can find that common ground, and then step by step, with hard numbers, and in searching our souls for questions, the more ethereal questions like, are we proud of what's being built? Can we be proud of this? Will people look back at us from 100 years from now and say, they did a good job? What a great place to live. If we can answer those questions with a positive yes, then we can proceed. But if the best we can do is acknowledge that a developer has a plan on the table that came from a scroll that was in some recess of an architect's, a second-rate architect's office, if the best we can do is accept that and feel we've done well because we get a public park out of the deal, then we've really done poorly with regards to our future. So if you don't mind, I'll pass these out now. And the model, for those of you who can see it, well, you can't see much except the tall towers, so that's telling in and of itself. I have about 8 copies. Shall I give them generally or just leave them, give them to you? So I hope I haven't offended my friends who want the thatched cottages, and I hope I haven't offended my friends who want the 20-story buildings, and I hope I haven't offended anyone who wants a 5 or 6 or 7-story development. I just think we can do well by this, but we have to work together. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see if there's some questions. Are there any questions from the committee? Oh, Councillor Osana?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for building the model. I find that it really puts things in perspective. Will you be leaving it here at City Hall?
Well, that's a good question. I would love to leave it somewhere if it was going to be effective. It still needs work. I would like to make another one of a much larger scale. If the planning committee feels that they could use it, then by all means, I'd love to let you use it. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just take a picture of it before you
Sure.
take it out tonight?
Sure, absolutely, yes.
So I really like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Neil?
Yes, if you were to take a picture or build a larger scale one and take a picture, if you sent it to our clerk, I'm sure she would distribute it to members
Okay.
of both planning and members of council.
Right.
That would be great.
The easiest thing starting off with that is to build a model of one of the high rises and sort of offset it with City Hall, just as a sort of example of to give ourselves a sense of the comparative mass. And they're very close to each other in terms of location. It's worth noting too, just as a visual concept, that if you take St. Mary's Cathedral and stick it on its nose, that's kind of equivalent to what's being proposed for those 2 blocks up there, 3 blocks actually. So if you, next time you're walking past St. Mary's Cathedral, imagine that standing upright, made of glass and within a stone's throw of downtown City Hall. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So the model is going home with me, is it? Is that the latest word? It is going home, but you'll take a photograph. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I think that means we'll ask you to stay till the end of the meeting. Okay, thanks very much. So if we could begin the next portion of the meeting with our director, who's going to say a few words.
Knock it out of the park. All right, is this, yeah? Okay, good evening. Thank you, Madam Chair. And just a little bit of a preamble before we get started tonight. Certainly, we're always pleased to be here at Planning Committee, and part of the approach that staff is going to be taking going forward is one of providing an opportunity for ongoing technical education for the committee and certainly for members of public that choose to attend Planning Committee. Realize certainly that this committee is tasked with very complex decisions on complicated planning matters, and certainly as part of the orientation process for any of our committees, there's a lot of information that you have to absorb in a very short period of time. So part of our ongoing efforts will be, and certainly tonight will be the first of what I see to be many sessions, is looking at bringing topical issues by way of short presentations to Planning Committee that are focused on specific technical aspects to do with the planning profession. Tonight, we're specifically going to be looking at some of the residential numbers with you. Now, this is part of an ongoing process that the planning department undertakes every 6 months, but we're going to be looking at sharing it with the committee, hopefully in a much more dynamic and engaging way than maybe what was done in the past, and drawing your attention to certain things so that there's a real understanding of the residential numbers that the city has before it. We're also going to be looking at specifically, Greg's going to be taking you through a little bit of a planning 101. So getting into some of the terminology that you'll see in planning reports, some of the things that go into the technical analysis that we use as part of reviewing applications, specifically looking at building height, how you evaluate it, how that relates to our planning policy documents. And then Laura McCormick is going to be taking you through what we're launching now as an evaluative approach to how we can consider community bonusing going forward. So community bonusing is another way of saying density bonusing, which is a matter that is allowed under Section 37 of the Planning Act, but something that this community hasn't taken advantage of to a significant degree in the past. So staff has developed a very comprehensive guideline looking at municipal best practice to give Kingston a better tool to work with in looking at bonusing going forward. And this is something that we'll be consulting not only with this committee, but members of the public on over the next couple months before presenting something that we hope that this committee will endorse and pass on to council. So thank you, and looking forward to certainly many more nights of discussion and bringing educational matters related to planning. And certainly if there's any topics of interest to specific members of the committee, please let us know what they are, and we'll do our best to put together a presentation with some educational materials that you might find helpful. Thanks.
Councillor Neil?
Thank you. And I fully appreciate that all of this tonight is on a go-forward basis. But I do have some questions because, as I understand it, there have only been 3 previously called Section 37 bonusing situations, and they happen to all have been in my district. So I had a few questions. I know we're doing, I think, a better job of public consultation. And the official plan states community groups will be consulted on the development application and the proposed benefit. Would that mean having a public open house or a public meeting that would allow members of the public, particularly in the affected area, to come forward and have questions answered? The commissioner may correct me, but I'm not sure that the 3 instances of bonusing that we have right now, there was any public consultation that I'm aware of.
Yeah, so certainly the guideline that we've prepared that's in draft format does speak to that particular issue, but certainly what the planning group has looked at in terms of municipal best practice and what we would hope to see on a go-forward basis if council's comfortable with this approach is that the bonusing or the community benefits discussion needs to be on the table right from the onset of a project. So anything to do with that development needs to be covered under the statutory public meeting, and that would, from our view, also include the bonusing so that the community sees right up front how the bonusing actually fits into the overall planning justification for that development. Bonusing isn't something that you bring in at the 11th hour to figure out how to make a project work. The key principle of any kind of community bonusing is that as a first and foremost principle, it already represents good land use planning. So it's a tool that the municipality can use where they want to look at specific alterations to their policy documents to allow that additional height and density in exchange for a community benefit.
I appreciate that. Some of the previous 3 and the first 3 bonusing that we ever did, I'm hopeful will be single trial conditioning and that we'll do a better job in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. I
Anne-Marie?
think we'll hear more too when Ms. McCormick introduces the topic. Now Ms. Sabio will do the talk on the pending and committed residential development study. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Committee, and members of the public. My name is Anne-Marie Eusebio, and I will be presenting the pending and committed housing review. It's an inventory of supply, a summary of housing demand, and also an analysis of a lifespan. So giving you a background of why we do this and how we do this, we monitor and report on the inventory of potential residential dwelling units which come from our planning applications, which are pending and committed. So committed means that these are the applications or those in which planning approval has been granted. So we're looking at registered plans of subdivisions, approved site plans, and final plans of subdivisions. The pending applications are those which have deemed complete and are currently being reviewed as part of the planning process. And these include your zoning bylaw amendments, your site plan control that's currently in review, and also secondary site plans. And we also monitor residential building permit activity as well from our City View building data. As mentioned from Paige, we monitor this and report on it twice a year, so that's June and December of each year. And the pending and committed applications cover particularly the urban area of the city. So we do this in order to comply with the provincial policy statement. So section 1.41 states that municipalities are to accommodate for residential growth for a minimum of 10 years through residential intensification and development, and accommodate for residential growth for land for servicing capacity sufficient to provide for at least a 3-year supply of residential units. So the 10-year and 3-year supply of residential units are reserved, and that's really a key point as we move towards this analysis. And as you know, the PPS, it's required by municipalities to ensure that there's an appropriate mix in housing density to meet projection requirements for current residents and future residents of the housing market. So I've placed on in front of you larger copies of the pending and committed residential inventory, and it includes a map showing where the pending and committed applications are, and they are color-coded according to the categories. So you have your registered plans, your zoning bylaw amendments, your secondary plans, and your site plans as well. And it also captures the servicing area. So you have your water towers, you have your treatment plants. So we know that Ravensview is servicing the central and east portion of the city, and Kingston West services the western portion of the city. This is a summary and a table format of the pending and committed residential supply units. So again, we're looking at the subtotals and then the grand total here. So again, the committed units comprise of the registered plans of subdivision, the plans of subdivision that are draft approved, and site plan applications that are approved. And we come up to a total of 3,814. With regards to our pending units, and again, these are applications that are currently in review with the city as of December 31st. We have our plans of subdivisions that are currently in review, our site plans in review, secondary plans, and our zoning bylaw amendments. So from this chart, we see that we have a grand total of 9,779 units. As I've mentioned, we also undertake the work to complete building permit activity and consolidate that data as well. So what we've done is taken a 10-year look at how we're doing from a building permit perspective. So here we have everything drawn out by housing type. So we have our single family, our semi-detached, and our row housing. On your sheets there, it shows the total of each. And we actually have some trend lines to show as well. Of significance here, particularly, we see that the single detached dwellings, there's a decline there. And then we also see an upward rise in the construction of multiple dwellings. We can speculate that the rise in multiple dwellings could be a result of demographic shifts and consumer preferences, student population and an aging population that may prefer to live in multiple dwellings that have more amenities and closer to the center of communities. This is a 10-year summary of our residential building permit activity for, again, a 10-year period. So it gives us the proportion by dwelling unit type. So you have your singles, your semis, your townhouses, and multiples. I'll bring your attention to the average number of units per year from a 10-year period to the bottom where it says number of residential permits. The number is 628, so that's 628. We use that number to calculate what's called lifespan. So we looked at the overall lifespan of our pending and committed units, and what lifespan is that it's the length of time it would take for approved units to become occupied, assuming that current trends of consumption continue. So if we look at our committed units, these are our committed units consisting of our registered subdivisions, our approved site plans, and our draft approved. So as I've said, the total is 3,814. And if we divide that by our average number of units per year, which is taken from our building permit activity, we have a 6-year supply. If we add our pending and committed units together, we have a 15.6-year supply. So at this time, we currently exceed the PPS objectives in terms of our 3- and 10-year reserve, and therefore have a healthy planning or healthy housing supply. And the lifespan calculations presented do not reflect the ability of the private market to respond to housing demand, especially through the phasing of registration and modifications which acknowledge changing consumer preferences. So by that we mean through the planning approval process, we may receive plans that may have a lotting pattern of maybe semi-detached dwellings at one time, and due to market forces, it's changed to maybe support single detached dwellings. Also considering appeals to the OMB, which could take a significant amount of time, but it is important to note the number of dwellings for these types of applications, as they may eventually contribute to the overall housing supply within the city. So if we're going to break it down, so we've seen what the overall pending and committed lifespan is. If we break it down with regards to the development-ready housing, so we're looking at units in registered subdivisions and approved site plans. So these are the units that are ready to go. They're ready for building permits. So if we look at the last column here for lifespan in years, we have 1.6 down to 1.5. We are meeting the PPS objectives. And if we further look at the lifespan with regards to draft approved plans of subdivision, which are also categorized as committed, we also are looking at our PPS objectives and satisfying them. So the lifespan in years is 3.1, 6.5, 7.5, and 4.9. So not included in the report that was completed, we decided to include some supplemental information in which we were looking at vacancy rates. And the source of information here is from the City of Kingston and the CMHC Rental Market Survey. So what we've done is that we've plotted the vacancy rates shown in the red, and down at the last row here, we see that we're from 2006, 2.2, over to 2015 at 2.8. And then we overlay this information with information from our building data, which is for the multiple dwellings. So here you can see that there is a direct correlation between the significant amount of multiples that were constructed and the increase also in the vacancy rates. You can see from 2014, we were sitting at 1.9, and then we go to 2015, where it is a 2.8 increase, which is a fairly sharp increase. In consultation with CMHC staff, 3% is reaching the 3%, which is healthy in terms of rental accommodation. We also looked at the average vacancy rates for Kingston and other municipalities, and we chose municipalities that were similar with regards to size and population. And just from the chart here, you can see that Kingston is relatively low from 2006 to 2014, and then the sharp increase to 2.8. So in conclusion, there is a decline in the construction of low and medium density development and an increase in the construction of multiple units. And as I mentioned before, this is really a snapshot in time, in a moment of time where we consider the status of our development applications and our building permit data. The pending and committed supply of housing within the city demonstrates a healthy supply of housing consistent with the PPS objectives and the desire to accommodate for an appropriate range and mix of housing types and densities. And in the near future, we will be looking at additional studies to explore factors which include your demographic shifts, student enrollment, local market activity, and housing affordability. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll see if there are questions from the committee. Councillor Neal.
A couple of things. Do we also have a count in the developments in number of bedrooms? And the reason why I'm asking that question is I own a house, 3-bedroom house in an older suburban area with 1 adult living in it. I rent a two-bedroom house with 1 adult living in it. But the developments that are going in the core of the city, in the University District, are every bedroom has an adult living in it. So do we keep track of not just units of development, but bedrooms being developed? And I think that's especially critical in the core of the city. Could you address that?
Through you, Madam Chair, thank you for your question. At this time, the purpose of the residential inventory was to track the number of units. We did not look at the number of bedrooms in that case, but it is a good point, and that's something that we can discuss.
I think that would be, especially in the multiple unit developments, that would be a very good statistic to have. in the last 5 years that I've been on council, looking at just the Williamsville corridor area, the number of approved, built, or in process of being approved is 2,663 bedrooms. And those are, so that would, I would assume in the next couple of years will tip up over 3,000 new adults living in my district. And that would be helpful information, particularly before the next election, because I believe we need to do a better job of counting students for electoral purposes. So perhaps if it isn't too difficult, that would be a good statistic to have, because a 2-bedroom home in a suburb, I think, is very different than a 5-bedroom university district development. So, thank you. Oh, I think.
Mr. Newman?
Through you, Madam Chair. So, in my presentation, I'm going to speak briefly to the distinction between units and bedrooms and as a means of measuring density, but it's a really important comment and question because it's something that as your planners, we are looking at a better way of tracking density and change in the intensity of use, and measuring housing by bedrooms is one way that we can start to look at the intensity of use. So there have been proposals for measuring things like parking by bedroom as opposed to by unit, because there's a different intensity of use depending on the number of bedrooms, and that's something that we're looking into.
Thank you. And my final comment or question, I think if there's a way that, and I know that this isn't a typical statistic, but I'm sure Housing and Homelessness Department would have this, all of this additional development that we're doing, I'm not sure the majority of it in my district and in the core of the city is high-end rentals. And we need to do a better job of encouraging and identifying affordable housing applications. So, and just so I can get it in and shut up, we often hear from developers in a rationale for approving whatever projects they bring forward that Kingston has a 1 or a 1.5% vacancy rate, and we did for 2 years in the middle of this decade. But that isn't the case now. And so I think we all need to remember that when the rationale for accepting whatever the proposal is that the city has a 1% vacancy rate, because that indeed, according to CMHC, has not been the case consistently, nor in the last couple of years. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any of our visiting councillors would like to speak? Councillor Hutchison, do you want to reach a microphone? Probably be easier. No, you need to yell or get a microphone. We have Councillor Hutchison and Councillor Stroud have joined us.
I want to follow on what Councillor Neal was saying there. You have an examination of the market and you set up a vacancy rate. So my question is, do you examine how the market is segmented? That is, if you have high rent units available, that's not much use to somebody who has a middle to low income. So I didn't see any indication in the presentation that you've examined that, and and what the market looks like for those who are seeking to rent something more affordable relative to their income. And we've had this problem in the lack of the analysis for years, like along King Street, where the rents are quite high near Lake Ontario Park, okay? Relative to the incomes of people that are seeking rental units. relatively? I mean, you can demonstrate that.
So, Councillor Hutchison, you're asking if staff has done?
No, I didn't see it there.
No, it
So I
wasn't
guess my
presented.
first question is, did I miss it? And number two, do you do it?
That's the one, yes, thanks. Can you answer that one? That we decide, work out the numbers according to the rents?
Through you, Madam Chair, that's certainly something that we're still exploring. The vacancy rates that have been presented to you, it's just very general. I understand that more analysis has to be done in terms of a more broader and more comprehensive look at the rental market, considering other variables, other affordability variables such as your market rents and the resale market and other affordability variables as well. So we will be intending to do further analysis on that.
Well, it's extremely important in terms of condos that don't get sold. And so that market doesn't serve most of the renting population because they can't reach that, or they're forced into unsustainable renting behavior. So my other question is, when you're comparing multiples to low and medium, and this is just perhaps clarification, there's a relative decline in low to medium size units. Yeah, oops, yeah, you just went by it, I think. It's right there. Yeah. So is that in absolute numbers? Is that relative? Like if you build a lot of multiples and the other doesn't change, then you've got a different market than you're building a lot of multiples and the others are actually declining,
Right.
and they're separating out. So
Right.
that, you're moving rather quickly. I couldn't quite follow that. So if you could clarify.
So yeah,
that.
the trend line here is just, it looks at the variations of the data. So if you look at the, there's building permit data in front of you. I don't know if you got a copy of that, but under, okay, yes. So there are numbers which look at the 10-year period from 2006 to 2015, absolute figures which show that the multiples in terms of construction has been declining.
And I guess what I was asking is that the absolute numbers of low and medium density are also declining in absolute terms.
That's correct,
Right,
yes.
so they're going down anyway. Okay, that makes sense to me, but I just wanted to be sure I understood that. Thanks.
Thanks. Councillor Turner?
Thank you, and through you. I thought this was in response to Councillor Hutchinson's question. This was just more of an overview, not a real in-depth report. So I just wanted to clarify that we weren't going to ask for, detailed reports of everything at this conjuncture, correct?
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, that is correct. Just to provide more of a background of this type of reporting out, Utilities Kingston has a particular interest in this type of reporting out as well because it looks at servicing capacity. So from the charting, it actually shows how many units could be potentially serviced by the Ravensview plant and potential units to be serviced by the Kingston West plant. So Utilities Kingston uses it, and it's more of a reporting out of our figures, how we're doing in terms of our development applications.
And Mr. Newman?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so this is a report that planning staff have done sort of on a regular 6-month basis for a number of years, and it's typically been a reporting out of the numbers. And so what we're trying to do, though, moving forward is to try and spend a little bit of time analyzing the numbers and what they're telling us within the market itself. So this is, I think, a very important slide for members of the Planning Committee and members of the community that are here to see some of the changing trends that we're starting to experience as municipalities. So we are seeing a fairly dramatic decline in the supply of single-family detached homes and a gradual increase in the supply of multiple family homes, which are apartments, and, well, really multiple family is anything with 3 or more, 3 or more dwelling units. So it's quite telling of the things that we're going to start to see as a community. And the other thing in behind this that we haven't incorporated into the report, but you get a sense of it in the map that you have in front of you, is the location where we're seeing these applications taking shape. So you can see there's an inset map on the map that you have that shows a number of little points, little properties, but those are properties that are being subject to redevelopment for multi-family buildings, and you can see that they're generally in the same location in sort of the downtown inner city core. So this, although it's largely data-driven, that we're just presenting some of the information, there's a lot of good information that can be drawn from this, and moving forward, we're going to try and provide a little more analysis. And I'll just make one comment to Councillor Hutchinson's question about the affordability piece. So vacancy rates are really low in the City of Kingston right now, which has a direct correlation with affordability. So you have a shortfall in supply that pushes the prices up. So if we can start to think about adding more supply, trying to reach a healthy vacancy rate of the 3%, which is generally the industry accepted rate, maybe we'll see a little bit of a price adjustment, but that's only really accommodating a certain market that sort of has an average household income that's in keeping with the average household income in the City of Kingston. The people who need affordable housing below that threshold, the private market, as I think many of us know, is not going to provide that housing. That's a form of housing that requires some government intervention. But the point being, this is really a snapshot of some data that we hope can sort of start a conversation about some other things we need to look at moving forward.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate all the work you've done, and it's very helpful. Thank you.
I saw Councillor McLaren.
Hi, just as a theoretical question, if we've got a 15-year supply, and if we are scheduled to start decreasing in population in about 15 years, does that mean we're done developing, and can we sort of focus in on redeveloping instead?
I was kind of hoping I'd get to take that one. So, so the two, actually, Anne-Marie, can you flip to the lifespan slide? Yeah, so I think there's a really important distinction to be made here between the committed and the pending numbers. So the committed is stuff that Council has approved. It's in one state or another, it's getting close to being shovel ready if it's not already a registered lot that's defined and available for sale on the ground. So the 6 year, I think, is the more important number than the 15.6 year supply, because the 6 year is available, or very sort of shovel ready development to satisfy that 10-year demand. The 15.6 year supply, so the extra stuff, is stuff that an application has been made, it's going through the review process, but it's not at a shovel-ready state. And as it relates to subdivisions, there's always that opportunity for the proponent, the developer, to say, you know what, the market is not, the demand for the product that I'm going to put on the market is not there today. I'm going to sit on this, I'm going to sit on the draft approval, I'm not going to register the lots, because as soon as you register a lot, you have to start paying property tax on the lot. So there's a disincentive to the development community to put things on the market if there's not a demand to absorb it. So I know the numbers seem perhaps high because the province suggests that we have a minimum 10-year supply, and here we're showing 15, but I think it's important just to recognize that the 15 isn't actually available for consumption today. And getting from the 6 to the 15, I mean, we're looking between draft and final approval and registration, you're 1 or 2 years, plus if things go to the board, you know, you're another year out. So there's always this sort of delay in reaching that shovel-ready state. So I think that's really important just to recognize in behind those numbers.
Madam Chair, I'd like to maybe just add a comment to that, because I'm sure that Councillor McLaren was referring to our population projection. So I do want to make a few comments on this. The first one is that our figures in our population projections do not include students. So I want to make sure that's clear, that when we look at the total number and the potential decline over time, that does not include any of the students that we have within the city. The other component to this is councillors are aware that we have actually now started officially working on our workforce and migration strategy, which will look at recruiting and retaining individuals that are currently not living in the city, and for the purpose, obviously, to make sure that we have skilled labor force going forward in the future, recognizing that we are anticipating a population reduction at some point in time in the future.
Thank you. Councillor Stroud has a question.
It's actually almost like you anticipated my question, because I was going to mention the student demographic as part of the analysis. I assume for vacancy rates, the growth pattern or student population pattern would have to be taken into account, seeing as that demographic is typically close to 100% renters. So it's an identifiable demographic of what kind of housing they might be looking for. And I know it's very difficult to count them, but we do know from the school board's recent actions that there is a demographic ebb in place right now in high school students of high school age. And I've heard officials at Queen's mention that their enrollments may be leveling off in the near future. It may be a temporary thing, but I'm wondering if that demographic ebb that has affected the high school system already is being factored in by the city in their projections for vacancy rates, because it seems like all those variables need to be taken into account.
So through you, Madam Chair, I will start, and if any of my team members want to jump in. So in terms of the vacancy rate, I think one of the things that's pretty important to recognize is that a lot of the applications that we are receiving in terms of multi-residential are being built in the area or close to the university. We are hoping that over time we will see a shift from these houses that are housing currently multiple students, 6, 7 students, and we're hoping that there's going to be a shift to a more purpose-built type of multiple residential housing. In terms of the actual number of students, and I appreciate that in Canada we are seeing a decrease in high school, but you might also be aware that both Queen's University and St. Lawrence College have started to really focus on international students. So there is obviously a lot of work going on there in terms of bringing students not necessarily from Canada but from outside, and that program has been growing significantly. So it doesn't mean that because in what we're seeing in our actual local high schools or even in Canada that will reflect the enrollment at Queen's or St. Lawrence, because they have been quite proactive in reaching out to international markets.
I guess so. Just to confirm, the student population count is not taken into account when calculating the vacancy rate?
Through Madam Chair, so we look at overall vacancy rate doesn't make the difference between student or non-student, and just looks at the actual units, so whether they're rented by students or not. So yes, they would be accounted for, but again, this analysis doesn't take into consideration houses where you have maybe 6 or 7 students living, where, you know, if you had a family, you might have a family of 3 or 4. So if we're able to have a shift or enable some kind of shift in terms of where a student reside, we might be able to reintroduce, hopefully, some families around the Queen's neighborhood.
Madam Chair, if I could just add to that, just for the committee's benefit, as part of the ongoing work that we do in terms of our own relationship building in the community, we do meet with our post-secondary institutions and specifically have a lot of detailed conversations with them in and around their strategic enrollment plans. So that's something that needs to be a focus of us going forward. As Commissioner Hurdle said, certainly there is an emphasis in post-secondary looking at the opportunity to expand enrollment by way of recruiting international students, or having very specific efforts that are focused on making Kingston attractive for people coming from other communities, countries, and it is something that we're looking at all the time. It's not factored directly into these numbers, but it is something as part of our data collection and looking at our neighborhood profiles and analysis and just overall population management. We do look at that quite closely, and we're very lucky that our post-secondary partners are happy to share their enrollment plans with us on a pretty free basis, so we do have access to that information.
Councillor Neal.
I apologize. I said I had a last question, but it wasn't quite my last question. I appreciate that we differentiate single-family, semi-detached row housing multiple. That's good information to have. I'm wondering if we also have, or can we get a differentiation between homeowner ownership and rental? Because I think that's important information. And if we do that, increasingly, like University Suites, we have identified condominiums, but they virtually all are investor condominiums that are rentals. And so when we do that, when we work on those statistics for rental rates, for how much affordable rental units we have in the city, I'm not sure that we capture it appropriately because it's skewed by condominiums that are being used by investors as rentals. Am I making sense? Because I don't always.
Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, it sounds just from your question that you're looking at the city to explore opportunities with regards to obtaining data for ownership of homes and the rental market. We do have a partnership with the CMHC who can give us that type of data. We also look at census data as well with regards to ownership and renters. So that's something that could be explored.
I guess my concern is that it may be listed as condominium and therefore owner, but in fact it's a rental. So, thank you.
Sounds like we're kind of asking for a very expanded report, but it sounds like staff are already understanding these requests, because we have more from strictly data-driven about residential supply into some big areas that I think include social services for some of the data Councillor Hutchison was talking about. So thank you very much for expanding. You probably weren't quite ready to hear all of this, as we did delve into some interesting topics. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we're going to have a chat about intensification with Mr. Newman.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, members of the committee, and thanks to Councillor Stroud and Councillor Hutchison for joining us as well tonight, and for members of the public for sticking around. So, yeah, a couple months ago, there was some discussion about providing some information to Council and the Planning Committee on the whole question of intensification and how we're planning for intensification, and I thought this was an important conversation to have tied with the housing discussion that we just looked at, because the two are going hand in hand. So I'm going to start at a high level, I think, tonight, try to touch on some concepts and some ideas, and then I think, as Paige mentioned, moving forward, if this committee would like us to come and speak to a specific sort of underlying component of what I'm going to present, then more than happy to do that. It's a fairly all-encompassing subject matter, as you can imagine. So just at a high level, planning is fundamental to managing growth and development in the city. Comments on the official plan that we've received over the past couple of years, I guess it's probably close to the past couple of years now, have highlighted the need for us to really think about the policies around intensification, so where we're looking to direct change. If we want to be the next Paris, Washington, or Venice, or perhaps the Kingston that we are already, we must understand how best to define our vision within the policies of the official plan, and how to use the tools made available under the Planning Act to achieve that vision. So I don't want to suggest that the OP as it exists today isn't a visionary document. It is, but where it's lacking, I think, is sometimes in the clarity of interpretation, and that's a bit of a weakness that has resulted in some of the challenges that I think we're confronted with today. So our growth challenges, as Anne-Marie went through, we're seeing a shift. We're seeing a reduction in the lower density form of housing and an increase in multiples. We're also seeing a lot of these multiples being presented in areas that are largely comprised of a mix of uses. So the downtown, for example, or even along Gardner's Road, we're seeing some proposals for some fairly high density residential developments. And I think what we're really starting to see is a desire perhaps of an aging population to live in a more complete community. So to live in a community where you can live, work, and play all within close proximity of the place where you go to sleep at night. So
This notion of complete communities is just that. It's supporting a mix of uses that allow people to lessen their reliance on the automobile and to be able to do a lot of different things within a close walking distance of one another. The shift in housing demand is also highlighting the need for a more strategic approach to how we deal with intensification and the achievement of a built form that's desired by the community. So this is really what I want to focus on, is intensification and built form. So questions for committee consideration is, where do we want intensification to happen? Do we want to be strategic about it, or do we want to sort of leave the gates open and allow it to happen wherever there's an interest in having it presented? And what do we want it to look like? So do we want it, as Mr. Soper in his delegation presented, do we want it to be a 20-story building, a 30-story building, or do we want it to be sort of towns at 2-3 stories? That's a question for the community. So simply put, so what is intensification? It's really just adding density through development. That's in its rawest form. That's what intensification is defined as. That's how the provincial policy statement defines intensification. And then it goes on to say that intensification can occur by way of redevelopment of brownfields. I'll just give you some examples. So this is Block D. It sits on a former brownfield site, so this is a pretty clear indication of intensification in the city. We have a couple examples here in Williamsville of development of vacant or underutilized lots in the community within previous developed areas. We have infill development. And again, we have the smaller scale development, things like development that happens through redevelopment. So, for example, a second residential unit going into someone's basement. So what can we do as a municipality to try and put some controls in behind intensification in built form? So the Planning Act gives us the ability to think about intensification through an official plan. The policies in the official plan can clarify what intensification is, where we would like to direct it, and to what extent. So what we want it to look like. We can control to an extent density through, or intensification through density parameters, and through built form items as well. But what's, I think, really important, and one thing that we're learning going through the OP update is to have an official plan that works, I think the way that it's intended to work is the policies have to have clear intent. So you need to be able to say that if you're going to say that development shall respect an angular plane, for instance, and I'll get there in a second, but we need to ask ourselves why. What's the point of an angular plane? What are we trying to achieve by saying that this 45-degree angle is important? So we have to ask that question why, and when you read a policy in the official plan, you shouldn't be left wondering. Secondly, we can have secondary plans and area-specific plans like the Williamsville Main Street study to give clarity in certain areas that are experiencing fundamental change. So we're in the early stages of looking at North Kingstown through a secondary planning exercise. Coming out of that will be recommendations to amend the official plan to build some clarity of intent and some expectations regarding built form and intensity of use. The last point here I think is important as well, because our official plan, in my opinion, and you ask a couple different planners and they might have a couple different opinions, but it's difficult to include performance standards in an official plan. Like saying in an official plan, you shall limit height to X meters, or you shall respect an angular plane. In my view, I think you need to have, again, the clarity of intent. So the height limit will be implemented through a zoning bylaw, and the height limit will be set to achieve these objectives: human scale, solar exposure at the pedestrian level. So those are some things I wanted just to present in terms of what we can do to control and have more to say on intensification. I've already presented this to council, I believe, but this was just the idea of trying to pursue a nodes and corridors arrangement where we're a little more strategic, as I say, with where we want to direct intensification. So the concept is that we have centers that become the focus of increases in density, and that centers are defined on the basis of being areas that perhaps have a mix of uses. There may be a destination like the Cataraqui Town Center and the area around that as a destination, or the city's downtown core, or a neighborhood that has unique attributes like Williamsville or like the future of North Kingstown. We also may define a node around a major intersection. So I have an example here coming up of the Kingston Centre being a point of the intersection of a number of major roads. Or it might be the site of a public transit hub. So if you think about the good planning concept is you put people where they can be easily served by public transit, and doing so in a sort of intentional way is good planning. This notion of the transect, I just wanted to show this again maybe as more of a planning concept than anything else, but it's this idea of having density gradually decline as you move outwards from the center of a node or a corridor. So I'm sure you've seen that before, but it's kind of the idea of moving outwards from, say, the downtown. Maybe you have your high rise, high density stuff in the middle. You have it then transitioning into medium rise, medium density, and then into the lower density stuff. And it's all about compatibility and appropriateness of built form. So this is not a new concept. This is in our official plan already. We have centers and corridors identified in our OP. The nodes and corridors is ultimately the same thing, but where I think we need to do some more work, and what we're doing as we speak, is trying to provide some more clarity behind what it is that's defining these orange circles, which represent the centers and the corridors in between them. So we're trying to be a little more intentional in how we're painting the map with that orange color there. This is just an example of what a node or a center might look like. So you might take an offset from a commercial core in a certain location where then you would look to direct the intensity of use, direct new development, so that you have a residential population that supports the commercial core and a mix of uses that are all ultimately self-sustaining. Interestingly, I think when you drive around the city, you actually, when you look for the taller buildings, they do tend to situate or congregate at major intersections and often on the fringes or close to commercial centers. And then corridors, I think Williamsville is a great example of a corridor. It's an area that we've been very intentional in delineating, and now we've got built form expectations in both the official plan and zoning bylaw with how we want that to be built out. So where do we want intensification? So centers and corridors ought to be defined to guide intensification. Areas intended for intensification should be identified through official plan policy. And what I mean by that is, so today we have in our official plan, we have locational criteria that we use when we want to say where high density residential should go. And high density doesn't always mean towers. It can actually mean a duplex on a really small lot. So, but the challenge today is the locational criteria that we tie to high density residential are fairly open to interpretation. So for example, it says located on an arterial or a collector road. That one's fairly self-explanatory. The next one is in proximity to a commercial use or in proximity to a park or open space. So if you're a planner on a file or if you're an applicant, you're kind of left building the case to say that it is an area appropriate for high density or it's not. So we want to be a little more strategic in making it the intent of that objective very clear. What you may see in a future iteration of the plan is an actual number. So instead of in proximity to, you may see something like within 400 meters of. So the clarity of intent is really important. One of the people writing to the city as part of the OP update said the reasonable reader should be able to understand where certain forms of development are expected. And I think that's a really good test. Of course, there are always the land use compatibility considerations that we should be thinking about. So again, that's when we talk about the intent. One of the intentions behind intensification is always to respect and maintain compatibility. And again, this is looking at the transect. So maybe we have, this is the center. This is where we want to focus density and intensification. Maybe we look at sort of concentric circles or polygons moving outwards from that help us to sort of have that transition. So that's I guess the where question and how we're looking at the where and providing a little more clarity in the official plan. The next question is how to manage built form, and I think this is an important question because this committee is being presented with some some applications that I think are different than some that we've seen in the past. So we have, as I say, I think I've touched on the first point, we have policies that direct intensification to certain locations, but now we need to set out performance standards that will help guide the shape that development takes. So we have in our official plan now some expectations regarding density. We do have, specific to some areas of the city, like Williamsville and the downtown area, we have height actually built into the official plan, height limits. And then we have this idea of an angular plane, which again, these are all things that, in my view, should be reinforced through performance standards, which are ultimately zoning requirements, so that, and that they're linked to the overarching policy objective. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples, but this is just to bring home the point that the way we're measuring density now, if you look at this, you might think that the building on the left, the taller building, is the one with a higher level of density, just intuitively looking at the building. But when I break down into what each building is comprised of, so this building is comprised of six one-bedroom units. So on an 800 square meter lot, this would have a density of 75 units per net hectare, which is our high density starting point. Anything more than 75 is considered high density. So that little home, if it had 6 one-bedroom units, would be considered a high-density project or high-density building. That's if we regulate the use by units. If we look at this example, let's say this building has 4 two-bedroom units, so density, if we're looking at units by lot area, and again, this is on the same size lot, this actually falls in the medium density category. So this building, which is larger in scale, is actually lower in density than the one I presented before it. So it's, I guess the point is just that you can't always assume that high density takes a high-rise form, and I think that's important because our policies today speak to high density, but they don't speak as clearly as I think they should to form, to built form. There was a question, I think, from Councillor Neal about bedrooms. So in the first example, again, if we just look at bedrooms, this has density of 75 bedrooms per net hectare. And if we look at the other one, this one has more bedrooms. It has 8 bedrooms as opposed to 6, so it has a higher bedroom density per net hectare. So there might be some value in looking at density by bedrooms because it's a reflection of the intensity of the use. There's been some conversation amongst Laura and myself and our consultants about some of the things we want to try and control in the zoning bylaw. So we're talking about whether or not we look at parking by bedroom, amenity area by bedroom, as opposed to doing it by unit. So those are some things that we're evaluating at this point. Height. So height, of course, is one that I think keeps some of us up at night. I just wanted to, I guess, acknowledge that there's been some recent challenges with height at the Ontario Municipal Board. The City of Ottawa lost a hearing at the board recently where they had tried to build height into their official plan policies, and the appellants were successful in building the case to say that the official plan is not an appropriate place to put height parameters. The argument being that the OP should be a visionary, high-level setting out the expectations for growth, but not building the box that we expect development to fall within. And so the next point here is if a municipality wishes to regulate building height, they should do so through their zoning bylaw, but that, again, it's really important that in the OP we're clear of what the intent is. So we're going to set height at this cap because we want to protect human scale, accommodate solar exposure at the pedestrian level, maintain and respect established built form in the existing neighborhood, respect heritage characteristics, and so on. So these are the things that I think we need to strengthen in our official plan, not so much to build more constraints, more parameters, but have that in the underlying zoning bylaw and have the intent really clear in the official plan. City of Toronto, if you haven't seen this, they have tall building design guidelines, and I just throw this up here as something that we might consider doing moving forward is putting together some guidelines that set out what the expectations are when we start to look at applications for a taller building. Angular plane, I just want to show this. This again just puts I guess, an illustration forward as to the expectations regarding built form. So this comes from the Williamsville Main Street study. It was really clear and intentional in setting out design expectations. So sort of, for example, a 3 or 4 story building wall along the streetscape with this angular plane pushing development in a step back, moving beyond that front wall. So this, in my view, should be reinforced in the zoning bylaw with the intentions being put into the official plan, as opposed to having the rigor in the official plan that really constrains us from having the flexibility to deal with good design that may need relief from some of these parameters. Just wrapping up, I guess, visualization. So I just wanted, I guess, to convey to the Planning Committee and members of Council that we're working hard to do some of the things that Mr. Soper is doing in front of you here. We've got LiDAR data, which is ultimately mapping of the city's current built form. So they flew over, it's essentially sonar, it picks it up. So we have that. That's City Hall right here. It wasn't able to pick up the cupola, but that's the city of Kingston's downtown. That's the built form, and we have that as a computer model. So we do look at this in evaluating some of the opportunities that we have in different types of built form. Where we're going, so we're in the early stages of starting the zoning bylaw project, and so we've got this awesome tool called City Engine. So we're going to be mapping out what the city could look like using this tool. So in the slide there, you can sort of see the purple lines represent, I guess it's a wireframe modeling of the zoning standards. We can put a skin on that frame and start to say, what would the city look like if I said all buildings could be 8 stories tall? And then you sort of throw in the numbers and it builds it for you, and you've got that there in front of you to look at the potential impact and feel and vision of the area. So it's a tool we look forward to showcasing when we get that project rolling. And some of the other tools that we're using, so this is in a program called SketchUp, and it's in Williamsville, obviously. So we were looking at this data is the existing built form. This is kind of the vision that came out of the Williamsville Main Street study. And this is sort of a rendering of what we could see moving forward. So it allows us, again, to build out what we might see, to look at what the repercussions of the impacts might be, and to start to get a sense of what that street's going to look like in 10 years. And 10 years is a fairly short period of time, and there's a lot of change happening there right now. The other kind of cool thing about this program, you see consultants present it a lot, you can do drive downs the street, you can sort of do videos of what it would look like to drive down the street or at the pedestrian level. So it's a really useful tool, and our staff are using it, which I think is really quite impressive. So just to wrap up, again, I think the questions we need to ask ourselves and the tests that we need to sort of put the official plan through are, where do we want intensification and what do we want it to look like? So the team's working really hard to get this third draft of the OP done, and it'll be available next week. And so I hope that you'll kind of consider these questions as you start to pick through the next iteration of the plan. Just lastly, as I say, what do we want intensification to look like? So we build the standards in the zoning bylaw, we build the expectations and the intent in the OP, but we have a lot of other Planning Act tools that we can take advantage of. So I'm going to refer to Laura to talk to one of the tools that we have under the Planning Act, which is the Section 37 community benefits. So thank you. Yeah, I guess I'll answer questions.
A lot of wonderful information. Thank you. Questions from the committee? Where do you start?
Thank you. I'm glad that you're mentioning fairly extensively the zoning, the enabling zoning bylaw, comprehensive bylaw that has been long overdue, I have to say, and every planner has heard me whine about this. I think we've had about 6 or 7 OPs, and we're still working with 30-year-old, in some cases, 30-year-old zoning bylaws. And that enables developers really to do a little bit of cherry picking. So they come, doesn't fit zoning, so they ask for site-specific, and they make a convincing argument, all the reasons why this fulfills the official plan. Or they come and say, this is our zoning bylaw, this should empower us to build, regardless of the OP. And so I'm looking forward to that document coming. Are we looking at a 2-3 year period before it becomes the enabling document for the OP?
Yeah, I would hope that, I mean, we're working on the zoning bylaw as we speak, and I think we've kind of got a sort of a 18 to 24 month timeline tied to it, but it really depends on our ability to respond in a meaningful way to some of the feedback that we're going to get. So, I mean, I think if there's one lesson we can say we've learned with the OP, is it's that we need to take the time to respond to the public in a meaningful way. So,
great.
And I think our director would like to speak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on that, definitely for the members of council, when we brought the project forward to look at doing the official plan update with the comprehensive zoning, we were originally looking at a 12-month program for the OP, and the zoning would start partway through, because the zoning, as you know, implements the official plan. So at some point, they almost become a parallel process. So because we've taken extra time on the OP, we've been working actively on the zoning for months and months. There's a lot of background that goes into looking at bringing together 5 zoning bylaws, which is what we have. We have over 40,000 zones in the city that have to be accounted for, 5 different sets of general provisions, definitions, performance standards that are measured differently in 5 different documents. So it has been a labor of love. I guess that would be the positive way to talk about it. But we have made a lot of progress, and it is coming along, and we're looking at hopefully in early 2017 having that wrapped up. We'll have drafts of it going out way before that, but we are working on that. I think for me, the really exciting thing is within a year or so, the city will be the best prepared that it's ever been to look at managing growth and development, at least in my opinion, in the time that I've lived in the city of Kingston, which has been about 12 years. We've gone through the official plan as part of the 2010 official plan that brought together the pre-amalgamation, but you're right in not having the zoning bylaw dealt with since amalgamation. It has been that one piece that has made things difficult in terms of managing our growth to some extent, because there's always that thought that, well, our zoning is so out of whack, like why are we even paying attention to it? It's 30 and 40 years old. So within a period of time, within this council's term, you're going to have an official plan that's very up to date and current, and also with a matching implementing zoning bylaw that amalgamates the entire city's approach to zoning in a way that it never has been before. So it is very exciting, and we look forward to working with you through that process.
And I often feel recently I have bragging rights, because the Williamsville zone that came out of a very extensive secondary plan and focused on the existing 3-year-old OP at that time, I think is a really good document. And it's a document that reflects a public process and reflects the current OP. So having a comprehensive zoning bylaw, I think would be brilliant, would make our job here at planning and at council a whole lot easier to have that kind of a document. So I look forward to it. Final question, and I did give Greg a bit of a heads up about this beforehand. I guess my concern is, given the demographics that we've seen in the current and proposed growth in the city, my concern is that we have a certain threshold of development, potential development. If we approve a lot of 20-story plus units, will they eat up the requirement for housing? And would that potentially or eventually create development deserts in certain areas where there could be sound intensification, medium density intensification, but high-rises have eaten up the market for that. That's a concern that I have.
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, the pie is only so big, and we're recognizing that the housing supply that exists today is consistent with what the province wants us to try to accommodate, but how that is consumed is a very important question. I think, though, one of the things that's missing in what we've done to date on the housing piece is the demographic analysis to go in beside it. And to Lanny's comment, there are a number of other factors that could change the demand for housing in the city that we really don't have a good grasp of yet. So I think change in student population, change in demographic, and just age of it. You're all very familiar with an aging population. The potential for inward migration, the work that KEDCO and our friends in real estate are doing to try and draw in new businesses and as a result, new employees and new inward people coming to Kingston. So I know I'm kind of beating around the question because at the end of the day, I think ultimately the supply of housing that we put onto the market is going to have to be met with demand, and how we satisfy that demand is something we need to consider.
Thank you.
Councillor Allen.
Thank you for your presentation. Lots of great stuff in there. I'll ask my shorter question first and then my longer question second. So in the transect slide, the progression looks fairly natural until the last one, where suddenly we have a big parking lot, which is, I think, what we're thinking about getting rid of with intensification. So how does that fit into that progression? Because that just sort of threw me for a little bit of a loop based on the nature of our conversation.
It's kind of a funny question because I'm thinking of when this was presented in my planning class, I don't know, 10 plus years ago, geez. And this was presented by a couple architects out of the US probably 15, 20 years ago, during a time of the big push around new urbanism. And I think this example on the far right there is kind of the less than ideal outcome of development. And so I hear your point, and I'm not suggesting that this is what we aspire to. We know we have to deal with parking, but in theory, again, back to a more recent planning objective in this complete communities ideal, is people don't have to rely on the automobile as much because they, again, live, work, and play all within close proximity. So that can take shape in a very urban built form.
Okay, great. And that actually leads into my next question very well. You talked about the complete communities, and I guess I wanted to get a little more sense of what mixed use looks like when we're talking about density. So, like, what are the ideal factors of a mixed use that we're looking to think about when we're talking about intensification?
I mean, it all comes down to context. So the mix can be commercial on the fringe of a standalone residential development, or it can be commercial on the ground floor of a multi-story building. So it really depends on context. We have, like, the Williamsville is a good example where the approach taken to that project was to try and recreate a traditional Main Street. So to have commercial at grade with residential above. But if we look at intensification in the West End, it might just mean standalone residential buildings on Henderson Boulevard with a commercial at the a standalone commercial use at the corner, just making more use of what is right now a very low density built form. So.
Councillor Stroud?
I want to get back to what you were saying about the official plan and the comprehensive zoning bylaw and relate it to anticipated trouble that we might, as councillors, trouble getting our heads around the explanations, I guess. In other words, where we could get our signals crossed if we don't have it straight when dealing with the public. And I'm thinking back to the official plan public meeting we had in Chambers about a month ago, where we had many residents come and speak to us about what they would like to see in the official plan, some of which was possible and some of which wasn't. And I'm wondering if it's my interpretation is correct that the directing people that with these ideas with specific things that they want to see or they don't want to see, that those kinds of things get put in the comprehensive zoning bylaws. Really, if we're talking about restrictions, I mean, you mentioned this, if we're talking about restrictions and qualifications like things like height and angular plane, that goes in the zoning bylaw. And so people are expecting when they come to speak to the official plan that they're expecting that to be the arena for that, but you're saying that the official plan really is a higher level vision, and that some of this engagement is actually talking to the wrong chapter. Is that, or is it a lot of things that apply to both, and it's up to us to figure out where to put it?
No, I mean, through you, Madam Chair, I guess at the end of the day, what I would ask members of the public when they come to present feedback on the official plan is, what is the intent? What do we want to achieve with what you're saying? So if someone has a passion for active transportation, what does that look like in terms of a policy objective? Is it that we want to decrease reliance on the private automobile? So I guess that's what ultimately, that's what our team's been doing for the last couple of months, is going through all these comments, and rather than just saying, thanks for the comment, we feel the OP does a pretty good job at responding to that, we've actually tried to take some time and look at what's the underlying objective of what someone is asking for. So that's what needs to be clear in the official plan, is the objective. Do you want active transportation, protection of natural features, uptake of sediment as it approaches a receiving water body through runoff? Like, there are some things that have come up that people can get fixated on the numbers, but we're trying to say, what are the numbers intended to achieve? And so we put that through policy language in the OP, we put the numbers in the zoning bylaw. That's what we're trying to do in terms of some of the ways we're looking at the feedback.
Right, so I guess if someone comes and says they don't like tall buildings and they're talking to it, we would have to give them this longer explanation like you have been giving about how it depends on the context. Like, where is it in the geography? Is it in the center? Is it in a node or a corridor where we've identified the higher density spots or not? And so we can't really rule out height as a blanket thing, because the plan makes allowances for different densities.
Yes, that's a good point. So one of the things that we might consider doing as a municipality is saying, rather than saying height shall be limited to 25 meters, for example, we might say height shall generally be limited to 8 to 10 stories within a major node. And that way you define the expectation regarding height, built form, but you don't put it in such a stringent box that someone seeking to be 10.5 stories has to go through a process of official plan amendment. You can say in the zoning bylaw, height shall be 25 meters, in the OP generally 8 to 10 stories. So you can reiterate, I think, in the official plan what that expectation is. But my fear is when you get really specific, it just creates a rigid plan that doesn't allow for the flexibility of interpretation when you get something that perhaps doesn't fit in that box.
Sorry, so just quickly to sort of wrap up. So you could say...
Just,
sorry.
It's okay?
No, I was just going to tie it to the concept of human scale. So if you wanted to address that in the official plan, you would have to give context, and you'd have to define the term, and you'd have to give context of where the human scale neighborhoods would be in the larger plan. That in the nodes and corridors you would have a larger scale development, right? So the concept of human scale is more in the residential neighborhoods. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. So, again, through you, Madam Chair. So, human scale is one of those things where, again, if someone from a member of the public raised that question and we were taking it back, trying to wrap our heads around, well, what defines human scale? So, is it variety along the streetscape? Is it perhaps this idea of having a certain building face at 3 to 4 stories and then the stepping back? So that's what we would do, is we would look at what are the features that define human scale, and then build that into the official plan in terms of the objectives that we're seeking is to protect a human scale being 3 to 4 story street wall plus a stepping back beyond that at an angular plane, but again, not saying in an official plan, the height at the street wall shall be 12 meters and an angular plane at 45 degrees back from that shall be established within the official plan, because it really constrains the opportunity to do something different without having to go through an official plan amendment. So the test when you do a zoning amendment, so you put that rigor in the zoning, the test is, does it conform to the intent of the official plan? That's the Planning Act test. So that's where if you have clarity in the intent, that test is actually quite meaningful in how you apply it. So.
Right, so human scale can go in the official plan if it's done right, and then the zoning bylaw can give more direction about how to achieve it.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, and I appreciate for the committee, this must seem pretty confusing, because we're talking about not having specific numbers in the official plan being the ideal. Meanwhile, our official plan has specific numbers in it. So for us, that's where Greg and I, both being fairly new, and we have a lot of new people on our team, I think it's safe to say we have a bit of philosophical difference in our approach to writing policy than maybe what was previously in the department. So as we go through that transition and we try to move from where we were to where we want to be, certainly the policy intent piece is what we're trying to focus on for the official plan. And because we're bringing the zoning along with it, implementing that with the performance standards being in the zoning where we philosophically feel that they should be. And I think for the community going forward, taking that approach, I think some of the concern, at least a lot of the comments I received when I first came into the job, was a lot of frustration from the community, feeling like we don't really uphold our official plan, or we don't have respect for it, we just amend it all the time. And that's because sometimes when you have too much detail in your official plan, any kind of deviation from the perfect meeting of that detail requires an official plan amendment. So that's from a philosophical standpoint where we're trying to take the policy approach that the city is taking in a different direction than what we've had before. It's not to weaken our documents or to undermine them in any way. It's actually to organize them maybe how they should have been. So it is a process, and certainly feedback that we've received through the official plan that's more appropriately a zoning related comment, we're pulling that through, and it will be reflected in the comment and response matrix that's 100 and whatever pages, and we will be presenting that to the public. So that detailed feedback isn't being lost, it's just going to be pulled through to the appropriate document, if that makes sense.
Any other questions? Councillor McLaren?
Thank you. So I have a small concern about the no numbers part. If it's true that we are sort of putting just the intent there, what I'm curious about, is it possible to get the intent very, very clear with a lot of the concerns that might be there? So for example, in the second part of the official plan, it talks a lot about sustainability, and yet we are building a lot of stuff that seems somehow unsustainable in many cases. How would that apply if we're taking away the numbers? Do you understand what I'm saying? So if we're talking about sustainability as being the intent of the official plan, and then we demand in the official plan 37.5 units per hectare or whatever it is to achieve transit, and we take that number out, that seems to me to be weakening it. How is this making it stronger?
So through you, Madam Chair, I think that's a great comment. So how we would respond to that is we would not take out the density targets. So those are actually minimum targets that we will have and retain in the official plan. So again, I guess it's not so much removing the numbers in their entirety, it's removing the numbers that are better used or better implemented in the underlying zoning bylaw, but keeping some of the numbers like the density targets, the affordable housing targets. Those are good objectives to have in an official plan. It's the performance standards where you say height, angular plane, setbacks, that sort of thing. But certainly I would not propose to remove the density objectives from the official plan.
And when you say performance measures, you want to move those to the zoning, is that correct? How does that translate to, well, actually, this is more to a different question first, and then I'll come back to that. if we want to make a strong official plan in such a way that is, the new buzzword is resiliency in the provincial policy statement, that we want resiliency in terms of economic shocks and cultural shocks or health shocks. How can we put that into the zoning law? Like, if we were to consider a tall building versus, say, an 18-story building, what if it's more beneficial to the city, say, in terms of taxes collected or transit or something, to have, say, 2 buildings at 9 stories or 3 buildings at 6 stories? Is there any way that we can have the more beneficial options be incorporated into the intents of the official plan and in the zoning without happening what happened in Ottawa? Would you describe where they tried to do that but lost at the OMB?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. So, I mean, I think you're hitting on a lot of great points. So again, if the intent of limiting it to, say, 9 stories on multiple sites versus perhaps one site with a taller building, if the intent is to accommodate an optimal delivery of infrastructure, of reducing impacts to the ground in terms of loss of exposure to the sky, of wind tunneling, of snow loading, and all the rest, if that is the intent, that's what I would build into the official plan. And the way that you achieve the objectives of the official plan is then in setting realistic targets and the performance standards in the underlying zoning bylaw. I think Paige brought up the comment or the point that our official plan is fairly recent, but our zoning bylaws, some of them are 30 plus years old. The expectations for built form 30 years ago were very different than they are today. If you look at a rezoning application for a new plan of subdivision, the average lot frontage is 7 to 10 meters wide, whereas on the west end, the average lot frontage is 20 meters wide. So expectations in terms of trying to achieve resiliency in built form have changed quite dramatically over the past 20 to 30 years. So we're building those standards into the zoning bylaw. That will be the expectation, is we're not going to support necessarily subdivisions that make poor use of land. And I think the same can be said for how we visualize multi-family buildings.
Okay, so if I got that correct, these kind of principles are going to be somehow in the zoning bylaw.
Yeah, I think how we achieve the vision of the official plan is by building parameters in the zoning bylaw. It has to be based on, I guess, best practices as well. So what we're seeing in other communities in terms of a built form, what we can legitimately service. So this comes down to the conversation I know many of you have had about the 20-meter wide road allowance. So it still needs to be able to function. So these are some other considerations, I guess you could say, other tests that we'll be putting the new zoning standards through, is what in the parameters help us to achieve the objectives of the plan, and what will actually function on the ground as well is an important consideration.
Okay, and one other thing, with regards to what is considered proper planning rationale, I understand that if it's defined in the official plan, it becomes proper planning rationale. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Chair, do you mean in relation to supporting a development application when you talk about the submission of a planning rationale that looks at all the elements of the development?
And for an OMB challenge?
Yeah, so we do have, we have a document that speaks to some of what our requirements are in terms of what's in an actual planning rationale document. We have that as a separate departmental guideline that's used to look at the content that would be part of any kind of development application. It's not specifically, it's like a thick document that goes through it in detail. It's not something that is spelled out line by line in the official plan. The official plan speaks again in terms of enabling, saying the municipality in support of development application has the ability or should ask for the following things to determine the justification for a development. So that's what's in the official plan, and where we take it a step further is in the development of the guideline that we have internally within our department. That's currently how we have it set up.
Okay, so if you're defending a particular judgment of council at the OMB, and we defend it based on certain arguments, what constitutes good planning rationale? Is that it's in these guidelines that you just mentioned, or in the OP, or a combination of the two?
Through you, Madam Chair. So looking at when you prepare a planning rationale in support of any type of development application, you have to go through the analysis of the planning hierarchy of policies. So you look at the provincial policy statement, then you look to the municipality's official plan, you look at the implementing zoning bylaw. So you go through the whole argument of looking at the hierarchy of policy and what it says and how it drills down from the provincial to the municipal level. So that's primarily what forms the basis of a planning rationale. The official plan also tells you what types of considerations need to be, or conditions need to be met in order for a development to be considered good planning. So there's a whole section in the official plan, 2.7, I think, if I remember the section off the top of my head, and that again looks to impacts. So impacts is one of the key ways of determining whether a development is compatible and whether it's good planning. So there's different elements of that are woven throughout our official plan, and then the zoning piece speaks to the physical built form of that, like the way that manifests on the ground from a higher policy level. So that's generally what's looked at in terms of a planning rationale document. And then there's technical studies that support that in terms of stormwater management, environmental assessment, heritage impact, it's depending on the context of the development.
So if I heard you correctly, in section 2, which is the most important part for high-level planning, if you were to put in something in there for resiliency, say economic resiliency, and fiscal prudency, that would become a new factor to consider in planning rationale. Is that correct?
Well, certainly what we have in our official plan in terms of what it says is, as a municipality, what we want to consider in looking at determining what constitutes good planning, yes, as a principle, that's in theory correct. Where we have a little bit of a challenge, the resiliency piece, I know we've had some good conversations about that before, and it is spoken to in the PPS, so looking at how to weave that to a greater degree. Section 2 of the official plan would be the section, because that's the piece that sets the vision, the high level vision piece for the community. The financial implementation piece becomes a little bit trickier, because typically land use planning doesn't take the financial considerations of that development as part of the planning argument associated with it, which can be confusing because the provincial policy statement does to refer to those things at a high level. So that's something that it's not quite straightforward yet.
So we can actually try and become more consistent with the provincial policy statement by putting in fiscal prudency in section 2?
I think we'd have to think very carefully about what that means to us as a community and how we would evaluate that, and then how that would be tied to it being evaluated as good land use planning.
Okay. I hope it can be done. I see you were shaking your head.
Sorry, Madam Chair, just one comment. So the resiliency piece, I did receive your submission, and we are looking at that as part of the official plan revisions that we're making. The PPS, the way that it speaks to resiliency is actually in the context of climate change. So if you look at the way that it's framed resiliency, it speaks to climate change. That's what I think the second draft of the official plan, that's the way it framed that section on resiliency, was tied to climate change. But that being said, we are looking at it from the lens of the economic, and there's one other facet of social, yeah.
Maybe even health?
Yeah. No, but your comments were very well received, and so we're looking at how we can incorporate them.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we'll move on to, if you'll introduce Ms. McCormick, please. Oh, or you'll just go ahead. Thank you.
Good evening, Chair and members of the committee and the public. My name is Laura McCormick. I'm a planner in the policy section. I haven't met a number of you. I have, I guess, this past weekend at the official plan update, but I'm looking forward to meeting each and every one of you. I'm here to talk to you tonight about community benefits. So in the past, they've been referred to as density bonusing, which you might be familiar with the terminology. You do have an information report that we prepared for this evening's meeting. So we're talking about Section 37 of the Planning Act. Kind of ties into the discussion that Anne-Marie and Greg had presented to you this evening about residential intensification and where it happens. So what community benefits is when you get to the stage where you think a project is good planning, how can we ensure that the project itself will benefit the community? So what kind of benefits are needed in that neighborhood to support the higher density or height? So it comes from Section 37 of the Planning Act. I've kind of cut and pasted the high level topics from that section. So in a bylaw passed under Section 34, so it's connected to a rezoning application, you may authorize increase in height and density in return for the provision of such facilities, services, or other matters as set out in the zoning bylaw. So basically, you can allow increases in height and density beyond what's permitted in the zoning bylaw in exchange for community benefits. In order to do that, you have to have an official plan in effect that has policies to allow the exchange of height and density for community benefits, and also enter into one or more legal agreements. So there are many other minor little sections in Section 37, but those are the key takeaway pieces that I think we all need to consider as we start to have the conversation about community benefits. So I guess the high level piece here is you have the as of right zoning envelope. If you want to go above the height that's permitted in the zoning bylaw or increase the density that's permitted in the zoning bylaw, you can do that in exchange for community benefits if the proposal itself is good planning. So when we look to community benefits, we try to look at case law that's been provided by the OMB. Most of it's out of Toronto because in Ontario, Section 37 isn't that well explored yet. It's kind of an emerging discussion that communities are having as intensification issues arise. So most of the case law comes out of Toronto, but the underlying principle that's been applied is that the use of Section 37 must be grounded in fair, clear, transparent, predictable, specific requirements that are set out in an official plan and are not arbitrary in their application. So what we're looking to do is actually initiate an official plan amendment and prepare a set of guidelines to ensure that we can use this powerful planning tool in a way that meets this requirement. So it has to be fair, has to be clear, has to be transparent and predictable going through the process. That's for developers, that's for planning staff, that's for council members, that's for residents in the community. Everyone should know what's expected throughout the entire process, from the beginning to the end, how the discussion is happening, so that there aren't any kind of deals done behind the door, closed doors, or any kind of accusations that it wasn't fair and clear. So we're just trying to set the playing field to meet this number one objective. So the official plan already contains the enabling policies, as the information report in front of you lays out. We've used them, I think, 3 times in the past. So the main policies are in 9525 to 9530, the height and density bonus section. They basically lay out the appropriate benefits that you can ask for, and the requirement to have community consultation, and that it must be good planning, and a few other detailed requirements. It's also mentioned briefly in a few of the other sections related to the environmental areas, major open space, affordable housing, conservation of cultural heritage resources, and City Hall. So going into the guidelines, our objective going through the process that we haven't initiated yet, we just wanted to bring it as an information report to kind of get the first discussion and a level of awareness out there about what Section 37 is before we even initiate the process. But what we're anticipating going through the creation of this set of guidelines is to come up with a set of governing principles. So first and foremost, the project itself has to be good planning. We're not going to make a bad application good by getting community benefits. We can make a good application better by getting community benefits, but it has to be good planning first and foremost. We're not going to allow increases in height that don't meet the objectives of the official plan and what our vision for the area is. So the community benefits themselves have to be secured in a zoning bylaw and a legal agreement. They have to be selected from the list of benefits that are identified in the official plan. They can be provided on-site or off-site, in-kind or cash in lieu. So in-kind meaning you could provide the physical benefit itself, or you could provide cash to the city, who will then provide the benefit. The location has to have a direct connection with the development application or the subject property. There has to be an evaluation that's done on a case-by-case basis to ensure that the value of the benefit is connected to the value of the benefit to the developer, so the value of the increased height and density. And obviously, community consultation is required. So we're anticipating laying out a little bit of a clearer community consultation and step-by-step process and the guidelines of how we have that discussion with the community. So we're anticipating that the guidelines will establish a threshold of some sort. We don't know what that threshold looks like yet, whether it's the development has to be, it just has to go above the permitted height or density in the zoning bylaw, anything above, and then you have that discussion. Is it a certain floor area of a development that sparks the community benefits discussion? Is it, are you 10% over the zoning bylaw requirement? And that's what sparks the discussion. So that's part of what we're anticipating laying out in the guidelines through our community consultation process. We're anticipating that's going to be connected to residential developments and the residential component of a mixed-use development. There has to be a physical connection between the community benefit and the subject property of the development application. So you kind of have to do a review that works outward from the development parcel and shows that there's a specific characteristic that's connected to the community benefit. So for example, if a property is adjacent to a transit stop, a community benefit would be upgrades to the transit stop. If there's affordable housing in the existing building on the property, community benefit could be providing money for affordable housing in the local neighborhood beyond what's already required by the plan. So location will be established in the guidelines. So if you're providing the benefits off-site, we want to ensure that we can choose a location that actually benefits the immediate area that's experiencing the height or density increase. So I kind of look at it the way that I've drawn it out on this map, that a benefit kind of has a catchment area. Each different type of benefit will have a different catchment area, but that catchment area should cover the immediate area that's around the development site. So the guidelines, obviously, what we'll be requesting is the list of benefits that are in the official plan, but the guidelines should elaborate a little bit on ways that we might be able to incorporate that when we're looking at the negotiation of community benefits. The biggest piece that we have to figure out for the guidelines is the evaluation component. So we currently have a draft of the guidelines prepared internally. We're having some detailed discussions with other internal city departments, and we're looking for a little bit of insight on how you establish the value. We don't want to establish something so stringent that it's a tax. We want to ensure that we evaluate it on a case-by-case basis, but in a manner that uses the information that we have available locally, so the real estate information in different neighborhoods in the city. Some neighborhoods have great information, some neighborhoods are lacking in information. So we're trying to establish an evaluation method to ensure that the value of that increased height or density, and we could take a comparison to the community benefit and have an equitable relationship between the two. So that's a major component of the guidelines that we're working out right now, the first draft of it, and then we want to have the discussion with the community all stakeholders involved in the process, but we're trying to get the background information about what's available in Kingston and the real estate information that we have in order to establish that valuation concept. So the guidelines will establish a procedure, so advising the applicant and consulting with the community, consulting with internal departments, assessing an appropriate community benefit, negotiating with an applicant, ensuring that equitable relationship with the value, detailing the community benefit in any kind of comprehensive report that recommends approval of a project, and entering into a legal agreement, securing it in the zoning bylaw. Obviously, the steps will be different on individual development files, but we'll try to establish a general framework that everyone can kind of follow and know what to expect going through the process. So the next steps that we're anticipating are continuing that internal discussion that we have on the first draft of the materials. We'll be initiating the official plan amendment application and releasing the first draft of the materials to the public. We'll be holding an open house stakeholder meetings for people who are interested in the project, having a full public meeting, additional consultation with stakeholders and interested members of the public, and then hopefully preparing a comprehensive report that recommends approval of an official plan amendment and also an endorsement of the guidelines that would go to council. So obviously guidelines don't have the weight of policies, but they are useful guiding documents that we're hoping that will give additional clarity to the process going forward. So I think that's it. If you have any questions or comments.
Thank you. And so I'll just make it clear that we as a council don't have the document. Of course, it's internal. So this was an information report. Some councillors might have suggestions for you this evening, or of course, anytime can send you suggestions. So with that noted, I will open it to the committee if there are some questions. Councillor Allen.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. One of my questions is if we're going to treat all community benefits equally in terms of the evaluation or decision. So what I'm thinking about is I think it's Montreal that has, as of right in the zone, if you're going to put a green roof or solar panels on, you can go a floor higher than the zoning requirement. And so I'm wondering if we're considering that approach. I guess that wouldn't fit under section 37, but it was something I was keeping in the back of my mind.
Through you, Madam Chair, I think we'll be reviewing applications on a case-by-case basis, so looking at the needs of the community itself, and also actually having a cost estimate of the value of the benefit itself. So we would be looking at, on a case-by-case basis, how much value is that benefit adding to the community? So it's kind of hard to generalize something which is such a broad category, but we will be looking at it on a detailed level to ensure that it does have the equitable relationship.
Great. And my next question is more for the commissioner, and this is kind of what I'm looking to see come out of our approach to conversations with solar developers in the future in the rural area. Same sort of approach, and even to a specific community benefit. And we'll continue that conversation at the Rural Advisory Committee, but it's something to kind of think about or keep in the back of our mind in terms of consistency and approach.
Councillor Neal.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and you've allayed many of my fears. I guess we can say, and I don't want to harken back, I want this to be a go-forward discussion, but I guess from what I've seen, we can say that the 3 earlier incidences of bonusing that took place for high quality of architectural design, the criteria and the protocol then would not fit the proposal for the current. Is that an accurate statement?
Through you, Madam Chair. I don't want to presuppose the outcome of the official plan amendment consultation process. Obviously, what we're anticipating is that we'll be requesting benefits that are specifically enumerated in the official plan. So if through the process people want to identify good design as a potential benefit, then that might happen, but I don't anticipate that's going to be added to the list of potential benefits. So we just want to ensure that what we're asking for is consistent with the official plan.
I appreciate that answer, because I know that it was a consideration maybe 3 OPs ago by a previous director, and his comments at the time were, we shouldn't be rewarding something that should be an ongoing expectation, which is high quality architectural design. And how, without having a jury of architects, can you ever determine, with all due respect to all the planners in the room, how do you determine what is high quality architectural design? And I've had this conversation with Greg as well. We see beautiful pictures of renditions of what it's going to look like when a project comes to us, but the projects often, upon completion, don't live up to those expectations that have been established in the earlier ones. So I appreciate that we have more specific and directed ones. And yes, I do. I'm also looking forward to, and you can comment on this, the idea of green energy component, or without calling it LEED qualifying, but the criteria that makes for more sustainable development could in fact, under the proposal, be recognized. Is that accurate?
Through you, Madam Chair, our current draft of the official plan amendment, I think we add additional language around green building and green infrastructure. So it is something that our initial thoughts are, yes, it would be considered a community benefit. Again, that's subject to the consultation that we have with the community, but our initial thought is yes.
Absolutely. I think that's sound planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Other questions from the committee? I know Councillor Hutchison has some. Okay.
Yes. Getting back to your guidelines and the valuation part or element in there, where you want to get a method to ensure an equitable relationship between the value of the community benefit and the value of the benefit going to the developer. So will that not involve knowing what the revenue stream that will, or profit margin that will fall to the developer from their development, so you can judge whether you got an equitable amount of community benefit? And I ask that question because it's like pulling teeth to get that kind of information. In fact, I've never seen it revealed yet. So, although, just to put context in this, when you read the homestead development application and you realize that, oh, at 10 stories, they can make money, that tells you something about their request for 20 stories. And whether you would want to even debate community benefits with them. So how are you going to have, now I realize that, so the follow-up question of that is, are you going to have a rubric to measure whether you've got the proper information to make a decision? Because without it, you won't be able to find an equitable value.
Through you, Madam Chair, we don't have the exact answer to it yet, but we are hoping to work through the details through the consultation process. We're currently working with real estate and land development staff, so the people at the city who are most experienced with dealing with real estate appraisals to work out and detail the information that's available in Kingston as far as how can we evaluate the as of right development rights on a property, what's that value, and how does that compare to the value of the development proposal. And when we look at the increased value of the rezoning application to the developer, you're looking at that uplift value. So the difference between what they could do as of right versus what the development proposal is. So it's actually working out the metrics of how do you figure out those exact numbers and compare them to each other.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. I think it's safe to say if we proceed down this road with some of the amendments that that staff have drafted along with this draft guideline, that of course we have to test through the public, through the development community, through council, the type of conversations that this community is going to start to have with individual applicants or developers as it relates to their proposal, if they want to be considered for density bonusing or community benefit, it's going to look very different to how it has in the past, just by the nature of the evaluation that will need to be done to arrive at a place where a recommendation could be made. So I agree with you and understand what you're saying now. Typically, and that's something through the consultation process, I anticipate a lot of tense conversations because most developments, whether you're a private individual or you're a large developer, they're for-profit operations, and people guard that information, very confidentially because it's part of their business operation. So we're going to have to find a balance as to how we can figure out a way to go through that process and have some of that financial information be available that typically in the past is something that would not be before this committee.
Thank you. So I think the answer was generally yes. You will have to have some kind of rubric so that you have an idea that you're not being buffaloed. And
yes, absolutely will. And to ensure that that any applicant that goes through and we make in consideration under Section 37, there's that sense, again, of fairness, transparency of process, that members of council, when they're making a decision, can follow the logic through associated with this is what's been proposed, this is what we're receiving. I can see that there's a fair trade-off there, that there's an associated value, and I'm comfortable making this decision. So absolutely.
if we do it, it will be amazing. That's what my opinion is. So the connected question is that I have here is, will the requirement to apply these guidelines be integrated into either the official plan or the comprehensive zoning bylaw?
Through you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, exactly.
Guidelines do not have the weight of policies as far as the Planning Act is concerned. You can make reference to the guidelines in your official plan policies, but it still doesn't give the guidelines the weight of policies. They're meant to be a clarifying document that helps to give clarity to what the expectations are, but we want to ensure, the reason that we're doing the official plan amendment is to ensure that our policies themselves are clear in the intent and that they have the weight on their own to allow us to ask for the Section 37 contribution and not rely on the guidelines, but to have the guidelines as backup to the policies.
So at what level will we integrate the requirement to use those guidelines on staff or in council for that matter, by, directly or indirectly?
Through you, Madam Chair, as part of our final comprehensive report, I think one of the recommendations would be that council directs staff to use the guidelines in reviewing development applications. So it would actually be a council endorsed guideline that provides us with that direction.
That said, too, just in addition to that, Madam Chair, we do have enabling policies in our official plan right now that speak to community benefits. They're called density bonusing. It's the same thing on a go-forward basis. They won't be called that. They'll be called community benefits. But what we've started to look at and complement to the guidelines that we've drafted, what that official plan amendment would look like. And what it's going to do is take a policy that is enabling, but it's going to provide a lot of clarity and definition to what's expected. So it's not going to have all of the details of the guideline itself, but it's going to have the key should, this should happen, this should, or shall. And then some of the finer details that you wouldn't expect to see in the official plan would show up in the guideline. So the policy amendment that would be done to implement the entire new process we're talking about would be at a much more refined degree than the current policies you see in the plan, and they'll be much, much stronger and clearer and directive.
That's the referential statements that say, go here for this, or...
So
I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. I just want to make sure that we're on the road to actually putting these guidelines, which look really good to me, in a distinct improvement and far more clear to this, which I think is your main intent,
yes,
to the public, that what are we doing, okay? And how do we arrive at this particular answer?
Well, I think what will be more clear is once we actually bring forward the draft guideline with the amending policy, then we can have a pretty structured discussion in and around what our initial thoughts are on a first draft. And if we've missed the ball or council wants to go in a different direction, we certainly would be open to that feedback. So we're just starting, but we wanted to make sure that we are starting with from an informed place, that we could not just be having this open-ended discussion about what do we think about community benefits. It's, well, we've done our research, this is best practice, this is what we feel are some ideas about where we'd like to go, see what the community response is to it, and then go from there.
So the intent is that the whole process has been too amorphous in the past, and we're going to try and clarify exactly, or more exactly, what we're doing. So in the end, what I got from what you said is there will be references in the official plan. I don't know about the zoning bylaw, didn't mention, Laura didn't mention that. To the guidelines and their applicability, but not, and I agree, I understand why they wouldn't be in there themselves, but they will be in the official plan. If you want to do X, be aware, this is what you're going to have to do.
That's correct, yes. It'll be very strongly worded and very clear, so it will give us an enhanced ability where we currently don't have one in our enabling policies.
Okay, just one last sort of comment or question. In the official plan, when you see applications come forward, and what muddies up the waters is a proponent for a particular development, the planning company, comes forward and they mention all the things that the good things that they're going to supply through their development. And they usually leave out half of the ones that are referenced in the official plan, the ones that don't fit the development quite so well. And so then the public, and it doesn't fit exactly like this, but you see this over and over. The public says, well, what about, 11.1 and 12.3 and all these things that I think we think are important. So it seems to me that there needs to be a requirement for the developer to address all of it, and not just things that happen to fit their particular development, because it makes for immediately for conflict and a more a fuzzier process. If they have to respond to them, or perhaps it comes down to request by staff, then people can see, oh, okay, I see what you're thinking here.
Okay, it was a comment.
Yes, so I'm not sure that was exactly a question, but I'll respond to, I think, the content of what you're trying to express there in that. So yes, as a first principle, any application that we would be considering as a community to enter into a community benefits agreement, as a first principle, that application has to represent good planning. So all of the elements of review that would go into determining whether it constitutes good planning, again, the PPS review or official plan review. All of that has to be present first before you can even look at a proposal to consider any kind of community benefits. It's not something that you use as a tool to make a project that's not great okay by the community standard. It's not intended to do that. So the components of the official plan as part of the rigor of reviewing whatever the development application is, those policy tests have to be met in order for it to be determined as good planning.
Okay, and I appreciate that, and you said that earlier. And I understand why you're saying what you did, and thank you for the response. I was looking for a response to the statement, and you did great. The point I'm trying to make is when you have a proponent making an argument based on certain elements, then you've got an adversarial situation immediately. Because they're like lawyers. They're making the best case for their client. And then the city has to, and staff mainly, has to fight a backward battle to point out, or the public, to say, no, what about X, Y, and Z, rather than just A, B, C.
I think we do get that. Thank you, Councillor Hutchison.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Councillor Neal.
Just a quick follow-up to Councillor Hutchison's question. If I remember rightly, initially when you showed the Section 37 information from the perspective of the Planning Act and the provincial statements, I thought that I read that the criteria for what would qualify would appropriately have to be listed in the OP, but to apply that, to operationalize that, there'll have to be some reference in the comprehensive zoning bylaw. Is that accurate or no? I thought that's what I took from it, but I may have mistook from it.
Through you, Madam Chair, I think actually the first draft of the comprehensive zoning bylaw actually has a density bonusing section, but the way that it's referenced in a zoning bylaw, that's passed under Section 34. So it's really when it's a site-specific rezoning application. So when you're looking at a site-specific zoning bylaw to rezone a specific property, that site-specific bylaw would actually refer to the increase in height or density, and it would say in exchange for the community benefit. So it would actually be specifically listed in the site-specific bylaw when it's rezoned.
Thank you.
No problem.
And one very final question. I know I've applauded several times the fact that we had a objective third-party urban design study done with the INNATE project, and I think that gave us a lot of information. Might that be something that would be applicable to this kind of process as well? So if we give a bonusing, we ask for an objective third-party input into it. One of my colleagues is saying no, but I'm asking that question not of her. So
let's see if that can be. Okay.
Through you, Madam Chair, I think as far as the evaluation process is concerned, there might be opportunities for a peer review of an appraisal if that's the route that we go down. But as far as the actual community benefits themselves, I think it's expected that the people with the local experience, the residents and city staff and the local councillor and other members of council would have a pretty good authority of what an appropriate community benefit in a neighborhood is.
thank you. That was much better than a no, no, no.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been, I know it's been long, but it has been really one of the first comprehensive, almost learning sessions that we've had at planning, and I really appreciate it, and I think we all do. Thank you. We do have one Piece of business, application for zoning bylaw amendment, 358 Victoria Street, with a staff recommendation. Do I have a mover? Moved by Councillor McLaren, seconded by Councillor Turner. Comments, questions? I'll call the motion. Approved. Oh, sorry. Please, let's hear your question.
I just wanted to check. I'm sure my only concern is about fire safety with this proposal, and I assume we've had that checked out. But I just wanted to get confirmation that that's all clear from our building officials and our fire chief.
Through you, Madam Chair, the application has been reviewed by all internal technical agencies, which include the building department and emergency services, and they have all provided no comment and/or will be reviewed at a further stage of the building permitting process.
Great, thank you.
I'll call the question. All those in favor? Thank you, that carries. We have no motions. Notices of motion, other business? No correspondence. Next meeting is May 5th, 6:30. Move to adjourn. Councillor Neal, Councillor Turner. Councillor Turner will be absent. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. And that was cast. That was passed. Thank you.